Good afternoon, Lord Brailsford.
Good afternoon, Mr. Stephen. How are you?
Good. My Lord, the next witness giving evidence today is Allison or Ali Calder of HELM training.
Very good, thank you. Good afternoon, Miss Calder.
Good afternoon, my lord.
Right, we will have some questions for you when you're ready, Mr. Stephen.
I'm obliged. Could I start by asking you to confirm your full name, please?
Yes, my full name is Allison Nicholson Calder.
Thank you. And you've already provided a written statement to this inquiry, and for the record, that inquiry reference number is SCI-WT 0847-5 zeros and a 1. Just to reiterate that everything you've said in that written statement will be taken into account by the inquiry, even if we don't touch on all of it in your evidence today. And just a reminder, the hearing is being transcribed, so stenographers will be noting down what you and I say, so please do try and speak slowly and clearly. Thank you. Now, you're here today to provide evidence on behalf of HELM Training, is that right?
Yes.
And you are the Chief Executive Officer of HELM, yes?
Yes, I am.
And how long have you held that role for?
Since the 1st of June 2020.
Thank you. HELM is a registered charity working with young people in Dundee, Fife and Angus, is that right?
Yes, it is.
And how would you describe the core mission or aims of HELM?
It's around education and employment for young people. So at the time we were providing off-site education in Dundee, but also working with young people in Dundee who were post-16 and had left school to get them into employment.
Thank you. So when we're talking about young people, the age groups we're talking about are between
15 and 25.
25. Thank you. And is there a typical background for the young people that you deal with in HELM?
At that time, I would say the background was the young people were coming from postcodes in Dundee where there was kind of multiple deprivation. There was a lot of kind of drug use or alcohol use in the family homes. Quite chaotic kind of family kind of life. That's changed a little bit post-pandemic, and we're seeing more young people from across Dundee, but at that time we were, I would say it was young people predominantly from kind of more deprived areas.
Thank you. And how do young people go about accessing your organisation?
Yep, so at that time we had our schools provision, and young people were directly referred to us from the education department within Dundee, and we had our employability in Scotland who predominantly referred. Other organisations could refer and young people could self-refer, but it was predominantly Skills Development Scotland that referred to our employability service.
And how many referrals roughly a year does HELM get?
So at that time we were getting around about 200 to 250 referrals, both through kind of education, approximately 30 to 40 through education, and then the rest through employability.
When you say at that time, do you mean, was that pre-pandemic?
Yes,
during the pandemic?
sorry.
No,
Kind
it's
of,
fine,
yeah,
just to be clear.
Pre-pandemic.
Pre-pandemic.
Yeah.
And has the referral rate changed at all since that time?
Yes, so since, well, it dropped during the pandemic, as kind of stated in my statement, that we saw quite a dramatic referral drop, but since then as well, the funding that we have for our education service has come to an end, and also the funding that Skills Development Scotland was distributing across Scotland at that time has moved to local authority, and the local authorities distribute that, so that's changed the referrals as well for our employability. So we're now more kind of 100, 150 a year now that we're working with.
Thank you. Now, you touched on these a little bit already, but your written statement contains some details on the range of services that HELM offers, and I just want to go through some of those with you now, if I may. Education, firstly, given the purpose of this set of hearings. Statutory education so that would have been during the pandemic. Yes.
Yeah. So we were classed as off-site education, so it was young people who weren't able to engage in mainstream education, but were still of school age and had to be attending school. So they would come to us for vocational training, either the last 6 months of their kind of school year or the last full year they would come to us for. And
I think you used the word, was it disengaged earlier? So the criteria for them accessing that educational service was they be disengaged from
so
school.
they weren't accessing school, they weren't attending school.
Okay, thank you. And you mentioned there about teaching in a sort of vocational style, I think. Can you just give a flavour of the kind of things that would be taught in that environment?
Yeah, so particularly for the young people who are in education, we would look at kind of core skills, so numeracy, literacy, IT, but through quite hands-on approach. So like we have a kitchen, we have a gym, we have a commercial garage, we have a trades unit and a beauty salon. We're able to, I suppose, train young people in kind of core skills rather than in a classroom environment, in more of a vocational hands-on environment. And for the young people who came to us for employability, and still do, then it's more kind of employability skills. We do deliver some core skills if they've missed that out in school, but it's more kind of employability and a kind of independent kind of living skills that we deliver, but again through a very vocational approach. So again, we have young people going up to our garage, working on cars, and learning to work as a team or to answer the phone and get customer service qualifications, and so it's much more employability focused.
Thank you. And just to finish the piece on education, so that would have ceased in 2021, I think. On-site education finished then. Okay, thank you. You mentioned some of your other services there already, employability being one of them, so I'll leave that aside, and it is covered in your. HELM also provides housing support, is that correct?
Yeah, so we were very much at the start of our housing support when the pandemic started. So yeah, and that has since then that's come to an end as well. That came to an end March of this year, our housing. But yeah, we had Hillcrest Housing Association gave us nomination rights to house a number of young people who had care backgrounds.
Thank you. I think you mentioned one of them already, but I noticed in your statement you talk about paragraph 7. I think you mentioned that their cosmetology and beauty therapy,
Yeah.
A commercial garage,
Yeah.
as you just mentioned, and a trade unit.
Yeah.
Could you just elaborate on what those centres offer in terms of skills or training for the young people that you deal with?
Yeah, so core skills are kind of delivered kind of throughout, and employability skills. So as I mentioned, things like customer service are kind of delivered throughout. But our beauty salon is set up to look and to replicate a commercial salon. So young people can get qualifications in health and safety within a salon, but also gel nails, different eyelash techniques, eyebrow lamination, so different facials. So they can gain qualifications that they can then take out and gain employment in a salon. Our commercial garage, at that time, we now have a different unit and we have an MOT station, but at that time we had one ramp in our commercial garage, so we could change tyres and brakes and suspension and anything kind of with related to kind of the engine of the car, and young people would do that alongside our mechanic, and they'd be able to gain 4 different qualifications in automotive skills through that. Again, very kind of access level based qualifications, but just to get them into garages and potentially in apprenticeships in the garages. And then our trade unit isn't commercial at all, but or it wasn't at that time, but we were kind of looking at painting, decorating, and potentially kind of joinery as well within the trades unit. So that was much more kind of skills-based qualifications and kind of practice, rather than, since then we've gone on to sell things like planters and different kind of pieces, but at that time there was no kind of commercial element to the trades unit.
Thank you. And again, I just gently remind you about the stenographers trying to take
Sorry.
notes of what. No, not at all. It's good that you've got a lot to say, but it's just the pace.
Yep.
Thank you very much. Now you mentioned that word apprenticeships, and that's something I'd like to turn to now. The inquiry's already heard evidence from Skills Development Scotland this morning, and we'll hear from the Scottish Apprenticeship Advisory Board later this afternoon. So I want to ask you about apprenticeships. Before we get to the pandemic and the impact of that, I just want to start by asking you in general terms the role that HELM plays in relation to apprenticeships and facilitating those, please.
Yeah, so we don't actually, we're not directly involved in delivering apprenticeships ourselves. So we, when young people have kind of gained qualifications through us and some experience, we then look to either college apprenticeships or employment for those young people. And quite often we'll have work placement opportunities, particularly in places like beauty and the garages in Dundee, where a work placement will lead to an apprenticeship. So we work with employers who we know deliver apprenticeships, but we don't directly deliver the apprenticeships ourselves. So yeah, so a lot of our young people will either directly kind of go into employment, but quite a high percentage will go into apprenticeships as well.
And what numbers would we be talking about if you know of apprentices that you're dealing with?
So it's reduced slightly because the kind of number of apprenticeships is kind of reduced kind of over time as well. But you're probably looking in a year at about 30 or 40. Sometimes we were looking at kind of 60 apprenticeships.
Okay. And so HELM has a number of partners in Dundee and perhaps wider that you would arrange to facilitate those with, is that right?
Yeah. So young people would spend a bit of time with them, maybe 6 weeks, just kind of on a work placement on a voluntary basis, just to see how they got on, and then the employer would take them on then as an apprentice.
Thank you. And I think you perhaps answered this to an extent already, but what kind of apprenticeships are we talking about? Earlier on you mentioned your learning centres in those areas, beauty, the commercial garage and trades. Are the apprenticeships purely in those areas or more widely than that?
No, so more widely. So predominantly because we have those learning centres and because we're known for that in Dundee, a lot of young people who want to work in that area would come to us knowing that we've got that route. But we would work with any young person who came in looking at any work sector to, first of all, for work placements, but then also either employment or apprenticeship. So it would really just suit what the young person and their family kind of needed at that time. But it wasn't just our learning centres. It could be anything. It could have been hospitality or administration or retail or any kind of different industries.
Thank you. Turn then to the impact of the COVID pandemic. At paragraph 25 of your statement, you say that apprenticeships became a lot more difficult to arrange and facilitate due to the challenges faced by individual businesses. Would you be able to elaborate for the inquiry on what those difficulties were due to the challenges that businesses were facing?
Yeah, so I suppose there's kind of a range of challenges in that we worked with employers to kind of gain those apprenticeships. And what we found at the start of the pandemic was that employers, some were having to shut their businesses, some were having to furlough their staff. So we weren't really a priority. Our young people weren't a priority because they were trying to organise what their actual own businesses were doing at the very start of the pandemic. And to be fair, so were we. So we had some young people who were out on an apprenticeship when at the end of March, beginning of April. So we were having to try and kind of speak to employers and find out what was going to happen. Would young people be able to continue with their apprenticeship? What would happen? Because there's the two elements. There's the training element, but there's also then the kind of the actual experience of being in the job. So we were having to work with employers to find out what was happening. But also we had young people who were waiting to kind of go on apprenticeships as well. And I think I mentioned in my statement that we had 3 young women at the time who were about to go into apprenticeship, and it was in a hairdressing salon, and hairdressing salons had to close at the time. And the owner was great in that he was able to do the training with them, so he could get them in one-to-one into the salon and do training, but he couldn't actually give them that experience. He couldn't kind of officially start the apprenticeship because it would have kind of eaten into their time of their apprenticeship when they didn't have real time to kind of complete that, because at that point we didn't know when salons would open back up again or when that would happen. So it was kind of varied, the kind of impact depending on where the young people were at within their journey. But I think I mentioned again in my statement that businesses were great, and although we were very much not a priority for them while they were trying to work out what was happening for themselves, they really kept saying, as soon as we kind of get people back, as soon as we can't take anyone on at the moment because we're furloughing staff, and but as soon as we're back open again, we'll have your young people back in, we'll pick this back up again. And but it was just uncertainty for young people, not knowing when that would be and how that would happen.
So you were getting positive messages from the businesses,
yes.
But it was just a kind of a holding pattern.
Yeah, everybody
I suppose,
was just a bit uncertain of what was going to happen.
Thank you. Can I ask you now then what the effect was of the physical restrictions that were put in place, because of the pandemic, on the ability of apprentices that you've talked about to either start or continue? You mentioned, I think, the example of hairdressers. Yeah. Were there any others that you were dealing with that were impacted by the fact that you couldn't, either whether it was social distancing or otherwise, that you couldn't
Yeah,
could be
so
elsewhere?
we had some young people in garages who were on apprenticeships, and depending on the size of the garage, like our own garage had to close, and we had to furlough our mechanic because it was very small at the time. It was a very small unit, and a lot of the garages had to close because they couldn't. Although it was a business that could stay open, because of social distancing, they couldn't kind of stay open, or they really struggled, or they stayed open but they couldn't have the young people in because it was extra people in a very small space. So it definitely kind of the physical kind of barriers that were put in place had an impact as well on the young people. And we were very lucky that in our main building, it's a very big old building, we were able to put measures into place that meant that we could keep young people safe, and we managed to get them back into our building a lot earlier than other providers did. But a lot of our employers really struggled with that because they had to prioritise their own staff first when there was social distancing and when there was restricted numbers, rather than our young people who were on work placements or apprenticeships.
Yeah, I think the way you put it in your statement, I think it's paragraph 45, is about them having to look internally before they could look externally.
Absolutely,
businesses.
yeah.
Can I ask you then about the financial effect or implications that this perhaps had on apprentices? Was that something that was brought to HELM's attention? You talked about the inability for people to complete their qualifications, for example, or to enter a garage or a hairdressing salon. Were you being told of financial worries, for example?
Yeah, so we, the way that Skills Development Scotland at that time funded our employability, young people got a training allowance, they received a training allowance from us while they were on work placement. So for example, the three young women who were waiting kind of to officially start their apprenticeship, they were on a training allowance from us that wasn't very much less than an apprenticeship. And so we were kind of constantly on kind of a fortnightly basis having to review. The staff were coming to me and saying, can we extend this? Can we extend their training allowance? So we were having to look at budgets to see, where we were at with our training allowances. We'd had some young people leave, so we did have money in the budget, so we were able to keep those young women on their training allowance until their apprenticeship started, because it would have had a financial impact on the whole kind of household, because that training allowance was going into the family purse at that time. So we were able to kind of mitigate that, but and we tried to do that as much as we could with most of our young people to try and mitigate any kind of loss of income around that, because it was slightly different with kind of being on an apprenticeship.
And you talked about those young women and that period of time. What period of time are we talking about, the length of that delay, if you like, or I suppose extension of the placement they were on?
So it was very much, so I wasn't actually working for HELM when at the end of March when lockdown occurred. So I was working with the staff at night, and at that point I was straight away, they were kind of saying these young women are kind of on a training allowance, and the time I came in June we were still talking about it, and it was not until after kind of the September, October that the actual business, the hairdresser himself, was able to kind of start them. So it was quite, it was probably about 6 months, 7 months that we extended their training allowance for, just to make sure that they had some income coming in.
Thank you. And I think at paragraph 49 of your statement, I think at least one of the rationales again for that extension was so that they didn't have to stop the process and then start again. So extending it allowed them to kind of stay active.
Yeah, and it was obviously it was really useful that the business was able to give them some training, because again I think if that hadn't happened they might have fallen away, and because we could only see them, we were working kind of in bubbles, and so we weren't seeing the young people the same amount of time during the week that we would have before. So the fact that the employer was able to step in and do some training as well kept them engaged. They were obviously frustrated because they wanted to get started, but it did keep them engaged.
Thank you. And was there, to your knowledge, a dropout rate because of some of the issues or difficulties that you've talked about? Were people leaving these apprenticeships?
So we did have a dropout rate, and it was predominantly young people who were kind of in the garages. I've not actually checked what that is, but I can certainly get that information to you. But it was predominantly the garages that young people dropped out of during that time because of the uncertainty, and they just weren't kind of sure what was happening on when they would be able to get back, and And then when we did, you know, we were trying to keep in contact with them, and we were trying to reassure them, but by the time everything kind of got back up and running again, they just weren't in contact, and they'd completely disengaged.
And was that people that were on the cusp of starting these apprenticeships, or were already
It's
engaged,
a mix of both.
or a mix?
It was a mix of both, yeah. Certainly young people who were further into their apprenticeship tended to kind of to wait and to see what was kind of happening, and they re-engaged again. But if, for young people who were waiting or had just kind of started and hadn't been long in their apprenticeship, then they tended to be the young people that disengaged.
And of those who did drop out or leave these programmes, are you aware of what alternatives they went on to pursue? Or
no, sorry.
No, thank you. And you mentioned earlier, I think, the word frustration when I was listening to you. Were there any mental health concerns that you were made aware of in HELM because of some of the things we've talked about, whether it's the finances, delays to apprenticeships? Were you made aware of those kind of concerns?
Yeah, so we saw a lot of concerns around mental health across the young people we were supporting, but also their families. So we were from kind of the end of March, beginning of April, we were going out to families and taking out like SQA workbooks and things like that to try and keep young people engaged and doing some work. But we were also kind of taking out food parcels, and at a later date we were able to get some funding for like Tesco's kind of vouchers and things like that, which again we were taking out to families. So not only were we kind of speaking to young people, but we were kind of seeing the family kind of environment as well, and we were really concerned for a number of our young people around their mental health, the mental health of the families that they were in lockdown with. And I mentioned in my statement that very early on we managed to get funding or apply for funding for an art therapist, because we were really concerned about young people's mental health. The fact that at a time when they spend a lot of time with their peers, they were kind of isolated, but also the kind of family situations that they were in as well. We were really concerned, so we were able to get funding, and that definitely helped. And our art therapist, first of all, was able to do some stuff online with young people and send out kind of art packs and do work with them. And then once the restrictions eased, she was able to actually start to work one-to-one with some young people as well, which definitely benefited some of the young people, because we could really definitely see the mental health differences with our staff team, who were adults, who were professionals. So we weren't surprised when we started to see, which is why we recruited the art therapist, we weren't surprised to see the young people impacted, their mental health.
Thank you. Before we move on from apprenticeships, given that, again, the issues and difficulties you mentioned, is there anything you consider that could or should be done differently in relation to apprenticeships in the event of another event like the pandemic?
I think just kind of getting information out, and I very much appreciate that everybody was, you know, trying to work out what to do, and you know, information around kind of furlough and things like that came out very, very quickly, and that was great. But I just think there's a lot of kind of not really sure what was going to happen, and a lot of uncertainty from the point of view of the businesses that then rolled into how the young people kind of saw it as well, that kind of uncertainty of what was going to happen. And even though we were reassuring them that it was going to be okay, I think they were hearing kind of so much negativity through the press, and that kind of just fed into their uncertainty and disengaging.
Thank you. I want to move on then to delivery of education by HELM during the pandemic. I appreciate you said that's subsequently ceased, but
yep.
Looking back at that pandemic period, and at paragraph 26 of your statement, you say that HELM was offering off-site education, and because of that you were considered an essential service. Is that right?
Yeah, so when the hubs were created across Scotland for children of kind of essential workers, but also for vulnerable young people, it was deemed that HELM could become a hub because we worked with vulnerable young people, which was great. We were so pleased when we heard that we were able to, and it also meant that we were able to get access PPE as well through the kind of education system as well for our staff. So that meant that we could work a couple of days a week with the young people who were accessing our education provision at that time.
And what age group will we be talking about?
15, between 15 and 16, in their last year of statutory education.
And what purpose or purposes did this hub, do you think, serve for the young people that you work with?
I think it was. I think there was multiple benefits to having the hub. The consistency. So so I'm supposed to say as well. Quite a few of these young people left in the June, so they were coming towards the end of their.
This would be 2020.
Sorry, yes, June 2020. So they were coming to the end of their education, their statutory education, and they were looking to move on to college and what their next steps were. But some were staying with us and would be then Christmas leavers. So I think that consistency was so important to them. Some of them had been with us for almost a year and had managed to increase their attendance. You know, they'd been not attending at school at all, and they were kind of coming to us 95% of the time of the week they were coming to us. So that consistency of keeping them engaged in something that was worthwhile, you know, the communities that they were kind of living in, the friendships that they'd had when they were in kind of statutory kind of mainstream school, weren't particularly positive. So I think they could quite easily have slipped back into that the kind of old behaviours that they'd had prior to coming to HELM, but being able to come to HELM and having that connection with the staff, and getting them out the kind of the family home and what was kind of, you know, happening at home. Everybody was in on top of one another. The majority of the young people were living in quite small accommodation. They didn't have kind of outdoor space, so families really were in kind of and for families where there were parents working, it was just quite a disruptive kind of environment for the young people. So I think to have time coming out of that, but some young people as well who are in residential units who were looked after by the local authority, who came to us as well. So for them to be able to actually have time out of the residential unit, which again were very chaotic, because there was a number of young people all kind of living together all the time. So to give them space out of the residential units as well, I think was really, really beneficial.
Because I think at paragraph 33 of your statement, you described the hub, I think, as a safe space, I think, for a number of these young people.
Yeah, and pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, young people have talked about HELM being a safe place, and actually sometimes it's quite difficult to move young people on because we're kind of too safe, and they want to stay. So they already, for the young people who'd been with us for a while, by the time the lockdown started, it was a safe place for them. So to have that safe place to come to a couple of times a week, even if it wasn't the same length of time that they'd been coming previously, it was their safe place, and they knew that we'd look after them. We knew that we had safety measures in place, and we knew that if a young person came in and broke those safety measures, we would take action, and so we were a safe pair of hands, I suppose, for them.
And presumably you would have had concerns if that hub provision wasn't available for those
Absolutely.
young people at that time. Yeah,
I really don't know what we would have prior to the hub opening, because obviously it took a little bit of time for that restriction to be lifted around hubs, and we were going out to houses, as I mentioned. We were going out to houses and we were trying to connect with young people, and I think if we tried to do that long term, I think it would have been more difficult, because trying to engage with young people in the family environment was difficult compared to them coming out of that family environment and coming to us. Just made that easier, and it gave them that space as well. Whereas if we didn't have the hub and we were having to go to them, and we were literally standing on the doorstep and like handing over workbooks and saying, complete section, C, and then we'll come back later in the week and we'll collect it again, and giving them bread and pasta and different stuff as well at the same time. So longer term, that would have been difficult, I think, for the young people to kind of keep that engagement while in the family home all the time. So yeah, it was, I can't say what would happen to those young people, but I don't think they would have had a positive kind of ending to their school year.
Thank you. I want to move on to digital access and inclusion.
Yeah.
At paragraph 59 of your statement, I think you say that HELM was closed from March 2020 until May 2020, and then I think you managed to then get funding for things, some laptops and tablets within the organisation and then we're able to move on to things like Teams and online provision. I wanted to ask, firstly, did the young people that you deal with, first of all, have the necessary equipment to be able to participate in an online environment?
Yeah, so certainly our education provision, the young people didn't have the equipment, and I hadn't realised actually until lockdown occurred that it was such a varied landscape in Scotland, and some local authorities, schools did give out laptops, some didn't, and I actually hadn't appreciated that until I started to speak to peers across Scotland. But no, so our young people didn't have any kind of provision at all. And I kind of say in my statement that we were quite kind of old-fashioned at the time and quite traditional, and we were very paper-based, and so we didn't have that either. We were, when everybody kind of had to go home and lockdown kind of happened at the end of March, we very quickly started to speak to young people through Facebook Messenger or text message, or just try to connect with them because we were really worried that we were just going to lose them and they were going to disengage. So any kind of platform at all, we were just trying to figure out a way of, you know, phoning them, anything, and sometimes it would be parents' phones that we'd be accessing the young people on, and that's why we then kind of took the decision, actually we're just going to go out to houses because it's just easier to do that. And then we managed to get funding for kind of laptops and tablets, certainly that was our education provision. Within our employability provision, it was a bit more mixed, 'cause we did have some who had parents who were in employment, so they would potentially be on the device that was in the house because they were working from home, or so that kind of brought about difficulties as well. So yes, they did have device in the house, but it was kind of shared, or they had other siblings who were also having to share we would give them a device, and then 3 young people would all be trying to log on to access different things.
Thank you. I was going to ask how straightforward it was to engage those young people when you could get them online. I think at paragraph 40 of your statement you talk about, I think, the move to professional platforms. I think you talk about children perhaps being familiar with Snapchat or TikTok. I'm not, but that's a big difference from moving on to say something like Teams. So how was that engagement process?
Yeah, it was really difficult, and I was really surprised, because young people at that time, our biggest struggle with the young people was to get them off their phones when they were in our building pre-pandemic. You know, that's and still is, that's our biggest struggle that staff have, is to get young people off their phones. So it was almost an assumption, I think, that everybody made, that we could engage young people digitally because it's the digital generation and they're always on a device. But actually it was really, really difficult to get them onto kind of a more professional kind of platform, like for example Teams. And not that they couldn't do it, it wasn't, some struggled with kind of the IT skills, but it wasn't that they couldn't do it, it was more that either the platform wasn't a platform that they liked compared to things like going on to TikTok, and it's very much a video orientated generation as opposed to a text kind of orientated generation. So we were always trying to think, how can we do this? How can we be creative and try and engage young people online? Because it was much more difficult. And I was meeting with peers at the time as well, both in the Dundee area and wider across Scotland, and a lot of people were saying the same thing, that actually this is a lot more difficult. You would think that engaging young people online would be really easy, but it was actually really, really difficult to do that. I suppose this is my kind of take on it, but I do think they kind of see their devices as that kind of social element, and it's kind of time away from school or from parents or carers, or, do you know, it's their time with friends and peers and the world that they're choosing to engage in, whatever that might be, and then for us to be imposing in on that, and kind of making them do kind of schoolwork or qualifications or even just speak to us, it was almost like they're kind of putting up barriers around, well, actually no, this is my thing that I do, and I choose how I'm going to use it, rather than us as professionals trying to come in and get them to do something we wanted them to do. But it was a lot more difficult then.
Yes, I think at paragraph 42 of your statement you talk about there being no divide for those young people, as you say, between the social and perhaps
Absolutely,
less
because
fun for them. You know, work.
yeah, 'cause a lot of the young people that we support, that is their social. Do you know, they're on devices a lot, and there's not necessarily any control at home around time on devices or anything like that. So they're that is their kind of their social. It's what they do. That's their entertainment. And then kind of during the day being asked to go back on again, and certainly as a professional, I know how it felt having multiple team calls in a day. You would be exhausted. So you know, to ask young people to do a similar thing, I think they really struggled with it. Certainly the young people that we supported struggled with it.
Thank you. Now, the inquiry is interested obviously in impacts at this stage, but also disproportionate impacts, and there's a section of your statement which you touch on this. Paragraph 89, firstly, you identify, I think, the group of young people of most concern or vulnerability, as you put it, as the post-16 group. Could you elaborate on why you think that is?
So at the time, they were the group that I was most concerned about because we had the hub for the under-16s. So I knew a couple of times a week they were coming into us, we were feeding them. You know, they were able to talk through anything that they had concerns about, and they were getting out the family home. But at that time, we were kind of contacting Skills Development Scotland kind of regularly to find out if we could bring our post-16s into the building, if we could do it. And you know, we had our social distancing in place, but it wasn't, that group weren't seen. And I understand that the under-16s who are in education were the priority group, and I understand that. But certainly for a number of months, that group, we weren't allowed to bring that group into our building. So staff were having to engage with them either online or going and chapping on their door and checking in that they were okay. So I was more concerned about them, and I felt they were more vulnerable because they weren't getting that support that the younger young people were getting, because they were coming into us. And they were getting away from the family home as well. So that's, although you might think the under-16s would be more vulnerable, that's the group that I was more worried about, because we were kind of losing contact with them, and it was just really difficult to engage them because we couldn't get them into the building and we couldn't do that face-to-face with them.
Thank you. And then at paragraph 90, I think you go on to talk about HELM dealing with those that perhaps already had mental health difficulties or neurodiversity even prior to the pandemic. And I think you say that they were perhaps most impacted.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate for the inquiry as to why you hold that view? Yeah,
so we saw a number of young people, particularly neurodiverse young people, who perhaps held some views around kind of germs and cleanliness, and also some young people who perhaps struggled to process kind of fear and kind of rational fear, and that kind of sense of kind of really being scared in a situation and being able to process that. And we could really see that these young people, in particular, their mental health was really, really impacted by it, particularly young people who were perhaps already overly paranoid around germs and cleanliness, because everything that adults had been telling them that they'd got wrong turned out to be right in their eyes. So, you know, they were really concerned that germs could kill you, and that, you know, you had to kind of wash your hands, and you had to, you know, stay away from people and not hug, and all for all their lives where they'd held these views, adults had been telling them that's not right, it's okay, you can give somebody a hug, you don't need to wash your hands so many times, do you know, and then suddenly everything that they thought's right and everything they've been told is wrong has turned on its head, and they're right. So it was really difficult for those young people, I think, to be able to process that, and since as well, like, I think we've seen young people who have really struggled to kind of, I suppose, kind of go back to normality around hand washing and hugging and these kind of different practices that I think the majority of the population have probably kind of gone some way to going back to how we were pre-pandemic, and for the young people as well who were unable to kind of process kind of fear, and you know, because they were for them it's very overwhelming hearing all the time that certain groups were more susceptible. Some people were shielding, some people in their families were shielding, and they had real fear about kind of grandparents or people in their family who had health conditions, and being able to process that fear and being able to, which I think at the start, a lot of people found it difficult to process that fear because nobody really knew what it meant. But particularly even as time went on for those young people, I think they found it quite difficult to kind of to process that and to be able to understand what that actually meant and what the real fear level was for them, and their mental health was really impacted by it.
Thank you. And do you think the referrals to your organisation now, has that altered at all as a result of that pandemic experience?
Yeah, so we definitely see a lot of young people come through our door now who talk about anxiety, who talk about depression more than I've ever seen in my career. A lot of social anxiety, and I can't say that it's because of that period of isolation, but young people who really struggle to work in groups. And we've always had some young people who find it difficult to kind of make conversations and feel nervous in a group situation. But it's a really high percentage now that we have young people coming in saying that, and we have to start with them in one-to-one, then they go into smaller groups, and then they'll go into a bigger group. Even then, we're only talking maybe 8 or 10 people, it's not a very large group, and just trying to get them ready for the workplace. And some young people we just wouldn't consider going into a line of work where you had to engage with lots of different individuals, and we would look at careers for them where it was more kind of individualised or more one-to-one or small groups, because they just wouldn't manage that larger kind of group. And I think there is a lot of social anxiety. Anxiety in general, I think, has been heightened within that generation, and their ability to cope with anxiety, I think, has really been impacted. But social anxiety in particular, I think, for that group has been, it's a real transition period. The young people that we're seeing now who are 16 were transitioning into first year when lockdown occurred. So I think for that group, we've seen it in past years, and schools have talked to us about the different behaviours that young people present with. But we're definitely seeing it this year. And we're not sure what's going to happen with young people who are in primary. But certainly we're seeing a different, and we have different young people coming to us than, which I think I mentioned at the start, that we've got a real range of young people who come to us now with many different barriers, rather than historically the group that we would have worked with in Dundee.
Thank you. Conscious of time, so I wanted to give you an opportunity, whether it's in terms of lessons learned, or I know you cover this in your written statement, yeah, but if there's anything in particular that you'd like to address the inquiry on before we conclude.
Yeah, I suppose for me, I have kind of mentioned this in the statement, but I think if, and hopefully we're never in this situation again, but if it did occur, then I think to try and have at least some time out of family home for young people, to be able to extend that hub model in a way that obviously schools hold thousands of young people, but in some way to manage so there's not complete disassociation from school and the building and the people, and I think as well some of the messaging around the kind of the pandemic. I think young people were hearing a lot that it was their fault. Young people were getting the blame for spreading COVID-19, and I think that was feeding a lot of the anxiety around the kind of the guilt, because they had the fear of relatives becoming ill potentially, or dying, but also the guilt that they were hearing through the media and through society around, well, actually it's young people that are to blame for this kind of spreading. Every time kind of a lockdown happened, it was to do with schools or universities, or and it just felt that young people were carrying a lot of that guilt around the pandemic.
Thank you. My Lord, I don't have any further questions to ask the witness, unless there's anything that you wish to add.
Nothing I wish to add. Thank you, Ms. Calder. That's all. I'm very grateful. Thank you, Mr. Stephen. 3 o'clock?
Yes, my Lord.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, my Lord.
Good afternoon again, Lord Brailsford.
Good afternoon, Mr. Stephen. Now,
My Lord, the final witness giving evidence today is Professor Steve Petrie of the Scottish Apprenticeship Advisory Board, or SAB.
good afternoon, Professor Petrie.
Good afternoon, my lord.
Now, Mr. Stephen has some questions for you, I've no doubt. When you're ready, Mr. Stephen.
I'm obliged. Could we start by confirming your full name, please?
Yes, my full name is Stephen James Petrie.
Thank you. You provided a written statement to the inquiry already, and for the record, the inquiry reference number for that statement is SCI-WT 0747-5 zeros and a 1. Just to reiterate that everything you said in that statement will be taken into account, even if we don't touch on each and every aspect of that in your oral evidence today.
Understood.
And the hearing is being transcribed, so stenographers are taking notes of our discussion, so please do try and speak slowly and clearly.
I will do.
Thank you very much. Now, you're here to give evidence today on behalf of the Scottish Apprenticeship Advisory Board, or SAB, is that correct?
That's correct.
Could we start off then for you describing the core aim or aims of SAB as a body?
The Scottish Apprenticeship Advisory Board was founded in 2014, and it brings together particularly employers, large employers, PLCs, medium-sized employers, SMEs, and we work with the Scottish Government and its various agencies, Skills Development Scotland, the CITB, the Scottish Qualification Authority, colleges, universities, schools, to make sure that the content, the frameworks and the content of apprenticeships, modern, graduate and foundation, are relevant for employers and understood by the training providers, the colleges, private training providers. But relevance is really the key. The world is moving fast, the world of work is moving fast, and we do all we can to make sure that the agencies putting together the various qualifications, do it correctly.
Making these apprenticeships fit for purpose.
Relevant and current.
Thank you very much. I think at paragraph 8 of your statement you say that SAB looks at policy, standards and frameworks and communications and funding across 5 different groups. Now, your current role is as chair of the standards and frameworks group within SAB, is that right?
That's correct.
So the second
Yes,
bullet on that list. How long have you held that role for?
Around 2 years, about 2.5 years.
Okay, thank you. And that role is a voluntary one,
It
is
is,
that
yeah.
correct?
It is.
So do you do other work alongside that?
I do. I have a real job, yes.
Yeah. And what is your professional background?
My professional background was British Gas for many years. I'm an engineer by profession. I then had 10 years in Balfour Beatty, a construction company, as business performance director. I then went back to Centrica and set up its net zero division. So I was particularly interested in skills, emerging skills with new green technologies. And very recently, I've moved for the 3rd time to a company called Evelyn Partners, which is a wealth management, and I'm heading up its commercial transformation.
Thank you. In high-level terms, then, what is the role or mandate of the group that you chair, the Standards and Frameworks Group? What does it do?
It provides oversight, governance, and constructive challenge to the arrangements in place for the standards within the apprentice family and the frameworks that pull those things together. It also oversees and provides governance and oversight to the apprentice approval group. There are a number of different agencies and bodies that come together, and in putting together qualifications, it's not uncomplicated. That there are a lot of moving parts. So we make sure that the system is operating correctly and reserve the right to challenge anything that's being done.
Thank you.
On an ongoing basis.
And what does your role in particular as chair involve of that group?
I chair a group of members. Within the Standards and Frameworks group, we'd have approximately 15 members, which is made up of trade federation bodies, trade unions, colleges, universities, employers, large and small. We meet quarterly, where we review the progress that Skills Development Scotland, the Scottish Qualification Authority, any other agencies that are involved. We review the performance And then we trigger extraordinary pieces of work that we think will improve the skills system. And to do that, we work with other parts of SAB. SAB is almost like a machine with 5 cogs. So there's the main board and then the subgroups. But we work very closely together. And if we need to, we bring in other agencies for ad hoc pieces of work. And if it helped, I could give examples of some of those.
Yeah, please.
Quite recently, I asked for a mapping exercise to be done of the process that qualifications go through in order to create a qualification, going from a employer or a college or an individual requesting for an apprenticeship to be created. There are a number of stages that goes through. That work is ongoing. It's quite complex, where we are looking to identify all of the legally required things that have to happen and the people who have to be involved by law. All of the people who are involved because they are subject matter experts, and an example of that is we formed technical expert groups where we bring in subject matter experts from different disciplines. So I put together the first technical expert group when we created the civil engineering apprenticeship in my time in Balfour Beatty, and we brought together representation, civil engineers, chartered civil engineers from Balfour Beatty, Morrison's, Carillion at the time. And the mapping exercise is looking to identify efficiencies and improvements we can get within the system in terms of agility and speed, because the current system is quite slow, and it's slow in part because it's a system, and systems by their very nature can be slow, but also because of the way in which the system is operated. So we're particularly interested in looking to see, given that the world is changing fast and employers' requirement for skills is changing fast, we need more agility in the skills system. We need to be able to create new apprenticeships. An apprenticeship in AI, for example, currently it can take 18 months, 2 years, longer from somebody thinking or saying, I need a new apprenticeship, to the first young person, an employee of a company, sitting down to be taught about the subject. So to do that mapping exercise, we've had to pull in colleagues from the Scottish Qualification Authority, from Skills Development Scotland, from the government, and that exercise is ongoing with a view to making it more agile, faster and more relevant.
Thank you. Because at paragraph 12 of your statement, I think that point you make about agility and speed is something that you've identified, I think, as one of your 3 main focuses since you became chair of that group. I think that's the second of the 3 that you provide there.
Yeah.
Thank you. You've touched already on the size and composition of the group, so I won't ask you about that. Am I correct in saying that the main SAB board would then feed back to the Scottish ministers on a quarterly basis? Is that, you talked about it being cogs and a machine, is that the process you feed into the board then deals with the Scottish ministers?
The chairs do. Coincidentally, we met with the minister this morning, Graham Day, for 2 things: a regular update on the work we're doing, and also to discuss the ongoing review of the skills system under the Withers review that the minister triggered last year. So we do that regularly, and also have ad hoc meetings with ministers, cabinet secretaries, as required.
Thank you. And we'll come on to the impact of the pandemic in a moment on apprenticeships, but to begin with, I just want to first understand from you how the apprenticeship model in Scotland works. What is the usual accreditation and assessment model for apprentices in Scotland?
Well, there are 3 types of apprenticeships in Scotland. A foundation apprenticeship, which is done in school, and it would be the equivalent of, I'm quite old, so I might occasionally use the word hire, and I know hires don't exist anymore, so it's a SVQ level 6, which young people do in school, and they get exposed and have the opportunity to go and work with employers. And they've been, very successful, and they've been driven through by developing a young workforce. And some areas of Scotland, and some schools in particular, have been highly active in foundation apprenticeships. And it's a transition for those young people into the world of work. Graduate apprenticeships, which are mainly used at this point in time by employers. So they are a degree equivalent, SVQ level 8, and they have also been very popular but constrained by funding. So I think the numbers of graduate apprenticeships 19, 20, 21, 21, 22 was around about 1,100, and it's been fairly consistent because of the funding constraints. And employers, I know from discussion with them, would put more employees through the graduate apprenticeship, and there possibly is an opportunity in the future for school leavers to take on a graduate apprenticeship. The benefit to the employees of companies, I should have said at the start, those undertaking a graduate apprenticeship are employed by companies, so they are paid to learn. They do approximately 11 weeks in a university or college, and it's mainly been employers who put people through that qualification because it allows them to develop and invest in and attain more loyalty from existing employees. So my previous employer, Balfour Beatty, used that extensively. It was very popular. Modern apprenticeships are the more traditional apprenticeships that I'm sure everyone will be familiar with. The SVQ level varies depending on the type of apprenticeship. And they would be, I think there are around about 90 modern apprenticeships in total in Scotland currently under various categories: finance, retail, hospitality, construction, etc. If you go on the Skills Development Scotland website, it lists them there. And they are for school leavers, typically, who leave school at 16 or 17 and 18 now. And they study at, so they, the point I'll make first is they're employees. And I use this phrase quite a bit. They're not students, they are employees who are employed by companies. But they study at college, they undergo practical training in the workplace, and they, as part of the modern apprenticeship, sit assessments which are accredited by the SQA. In college, they do examinations in college, and then they have work-based assessments where they have to demonstrate particular competence in doing particular things depending on the industry or the sector that the modern apprenticeship they're taking is in.
Thank you very much. So that assessment, as you just mentioned, is field-based or on-site or on the job, that assessment process. That's an important part of it. Thank you. Turning then to the effect of the pandemic on apprenticeships, at the third bullet in paragraph 12 of your statement, I think you say that the pandemic and lockdown really highlighted and exacerbated issues within the assessment system. I'd want to explore some of those issues with you now. At paragraph 13, you say that the pandemic highlighted a significant issue with on-field assessment of apprentices and the content of those assessments, and then in paragraph 14 you go on to say the issue is best explained by way of example. So could I invite you to explain what that issue was with reference to the example that you give in that paragraph?
Yes. So the example I gave was a person going through a joinery apprenticeship, and as part of that assessment, as part of the apprenticeship, the person will learn the practical skills in terms of how to join wood and how to plane and all the various practical things they need to do. But they will learn about particular types of work, you know, with a capital W. And part of that apprenticeship would be roofing. Now, in the world that we live in today, much of our economy is made up of SMEs. It's made up of companies who specialise in very particular things. And I used the example of a kitchen company. For many kitchen companies, it wouldn't be out of the question for a kitchen company to do roofing. Of course it wouldn't if somebody's having an extension. But for the vast majority of kitchen companies, they will enter a customer's property and replace the kitchen, redesign and replace the kitchen in the vast majority of cases. So under normal circumstances, when we don't have a pandemic, they would do their practical work in college. They would obviously get hands-on experience installing kitchens, working with a mentor or a buddy during the day-to-day work. But they're also required to demonstrate competence, as well as passing ongoing assessments and exams in college. They're required to demonstrate competence as an accredited assessor in the workplace. And in the case of a kitchen company, doing a joinery monitored apprenticeship, that would be in somebody's house. It could be in a commercial premises, but particularly it would be in somebody's house. Now, when the pandemic hit, as we all remember, there were various degrees of lockdown. And there were various things at different times that we all had to do to protect ourselves and protect other people. So for quite a period of time, and at the time I was in Balfour Beatty, and when the pandemic hit in 2020, we had 24 construction sites, one not far from here in Edinburgh, where they are currently working on the North Bridge. So all the sites were closed. They were quite quickly opened for critical construction, things like schools, hospitals, roads, etc., within about a month. So we reopened the sites with severe constraints and limitations, personal protection, personal protective equipment, social distancing, only one person around in a room at a time. And that would have been the case for joinery companies and kitchen installation companies. They would have been severely restricted. So number one, the apprentices wouldn't have been at work for a long period of time. They would have been home-based. Some may have been furloughed. I don't have the data on how many that would be, but many apprentices would have been furloughed. When they would have returned to work, where under the law they could enter into customers' properties, they would have been subject to the severe limitations and unusual working circumstances that all construction companies saw. And if it were the case that only one person was allowed to work in a room at a time, that would have elongated their absence from the workplace, the site, or the customer's home. What that did, it meant that many apprentices for a long period of time could not go through their on-the-job assessments. And we found a situation where assessments started to accumulate over a long period of time, over months and years, and a backlog had to be addressed to make sure that the apprentices could complete and pass their assessment. That was compounded by the fact that they may have been sitting at home for a year, and many of the things they'd learnt and many of the skills that they'd attained could have been forgotten, could have been lost, could have been a bit rusty. And it got to a situation where over 1,000 young people had not completed their apprenticeships. The figure got up as high as around 1,400, where I got involved to help the situation by pulling stakeholders together to see how we could alleviate the problem.
Thank you, and we'll come back to that backlog that you mentioned. Just to be clear, this on-site assessment issue, was this something that existed prior to the pandemic but was exacerbated by COVID?
Yes.
That's correct. So
Yes.
This wasn't a novel issue, it was just something that was worsened, in your view, by the restrictions that were put in place?
It was an existing arrangement and requirement that existed when the pandemic happened. However, employers, I think I made reference to it in the statement, were unhappy with that situation. And the example of the kitchen company who don't do roofing is a good example. It's very difficult for an SME with an owner, manager, worker who employs an apprentice to find roof work for that apprentice to demonstrate competence if they have no work like that in their order book. So particularly for SMEs, for a big company like Balfour Beatty, they will find a roof somewhere that the apprentice can go and get experience and demonstrate competence on top of what they've learned in college. For SMEs, it's very difficult if they don't have that type of work.
And what was the solution then for SMEs that you mentioned in the circumstances of the pandemic? What could anything be done in that sense?
I brought together the various stakeholders, organisations like the CITB, SQA, the trade union, Skills Development Scotland, and with other employers and with trade bodies offered alternative solutions, systemic alternatives to the existing solution. For example, it could be possible for a young person to build up a diary or a portfolio of expertise and demonstrable competence over a period of time. And that would give particularly smaller companies time to organise with other companies they know relevant work that the young person needs. Complementing that, it could be possible for the young person to get that experience in college, for colleges to provide to kitchen companies roof work, because colleges, the length and breadth of Scotland, will teach roof work, and it could be possible for that hands-on practical demonstration of competence to be done in a college, but that's not possible because it's not classified as a workplace. It could be possible for for us to collectively set up a more systemic and formal arrangement where companies and organisations share experience with apprentices. So larger companies, Care, Costain, Balfour Beatty, could offer up relevant work experience to companies within the supply chain who ordinarily wouldn't be able to give their young people that experience. That will happen on an informal basis because the larger companies will look after the supply chain and their subcontractors, and I'm sure these things may happen informally, but we could put more agility into our skills system for that, particularly with digital technology being the way it is. I can order an Uber on my phone and it will come to within 3 metres of where I'm standing, so I'm sure we could create some digital technology, a diary booking system to share available slots for work experience and competence assessments for young people. So there are a number of things that we could do. And because we came together as a group of stakeholders, we were able to accelerate the activity in the existing system to get more young people through the current way of working. But in the longer term, I think the opportunity and the need exists for more agility and speed to exist within the system, so it is more flexible and taking cognizance of all of the various circumstances of different sizes of organisations.
Thank you. And we'll come back, hopefully at the end, to what, in your view, at least could or might be done in respect of apprenticeships. Sticking with the on-field assessment just for a moment, was at least one effect of that apprentices were stuck in the system if they could not be assessed?
Yes.
So they found themselves, in essence, in some sort of limbo.
Yes, the reason I was aware of the developing situation, but one of the trade federation bodies made a statement one day, because COVID passed quickly, but it dragged. Things happened very slowly during COVID, and it was difficult to understand at the time exactly what was happening and what was going on. And data isn't produced, particularly around skills, that frequently. It tends to be annually that data is produced on apprentices entering the system, apprentices dropping out, and apprentices going through. And after a period of time, 18 months, 2 years, I became aware of apprentices in their 6th year of a 4-year apprenticeship. And that means that young person is stuck in that system and is still earning apprentice wages, is only contributing apprentice tax into HMRC. That will put pressure on families because many families rely on the apprentice wage coming into the house. So that really brought it home. I spoke to some apprentices to find out the impact it was having on them, and it wasn't a good situation for apprentices to be in. They wanted to complete their qualification, they wanted to work, they wanted to contribute.
Thank you. You spoke very helpfully there, I think, about the financial impact that some of these apprentices would have been feeling.
Sorry, Chris, and also for the employers. I mean, employers have invested in 3 or 4 years in the apprentice. So the return on investment in the apprentice and the ability for the apprentice to generate wealth for the organisation that's employing them was also compromised.
Thank you. Were you aware of what the dropout rate, if any, was, given the status quo as it was during the pandemic, was there a significant number of apprentices which were leaving their apprenticeships altogether?
In advance of today's hearing, I got two pieces of data, which is in the public domain, and well, three pieces of data: foundation and graduate apprenticeships, which remained fairly consistent. And that didn't surprise me, because the foundation apprentices who were at school would have been doing work and work experience online. You know, I was involved in several online work experience opportunities for young people during COVID, and they worked very well. Same with graduate apprentices, they would have been able to do their coursework. All the universities and colleges pivoted immediately via Zoom and Teams to online teaching. A modern apprenticeship, because of what we're talking about, was different. Apprentice numbers in 2019, modern apprentice numbers in 2019 were just under 27,618, or just under 28,000. In 2020, just over 18,000, just under 19,000. So a drop of 9,000 for obvious reasons, because that was at the height. August 2020 would have been, from memory, at the height of lockdown and the difficulties. It increased again in 2021 to around about 25,000, so it never recovered to the 28. I asked for the data on dropouts, and they were fairly consistent at about 4%, but I don't know how that is measured. I just don't know how that is measured. So that surprised me, that the dropout level wasn't higher in 2020 and 21. But I'm sure that data is more available. I couldn't get it for today's inquiry.
And in terms of longer term impacts, if any, do you think there has been in terms of available and working apprentices, do you think has that diminished or dropped following what happened during the pandemic?
We have a skills shortage, and that's been the case. I think Scotland is doing well. I think the Scottish model is very good. I think what the Scottish government done is amongst the best. I don't think we're as far ahead as some of the European companies. You know, Germany has been very, very strong, as many you'll know, on apprenticeships for decades. I think we're doing very well in building apprentice capability. But that drop of 9,000 modern apprenticeships in 2020 only compounded the existing skills shortage. And there's a huge amount of work being done by developing the young workforce, Skills Development Scotland. SAB is purely there to support and help, but many of the agencies have done a great job in highlighting the benefits of apprenticeships, the importance of apprenticeships, and overcoming some of the stigma that still exists within schools, within parents, carers, to encourage more young people to go in to apprenticeships. You know, and many companies now realise that it's, as you know, there is parity between an apprentice and a graduate. The opportunities in some companies and many companies are the same. You know, if people work hard, they can go all the way through the ranks, having come in as an apprentice. But I think that dip in 2020 only made the skills shortage, you know, more difficult to recover from.
Thank you. I want to move on to talk about some of the worker efforts that SAB was making during that pandemic period, and to an extent you've covered that already. You talked about convening certain parties together to try and move things forward. I just wanted to check, following, I think at paragraph 17, you talk about, I think, that convening power and arranging a meeting of relevant parties. I think you mentioned the Scottish Vocational Qualifications, the Construction Industry Training Board, getting them all together.
Yeah.
As an outcome of that, you say at that paragraph, you then wrote to the relevant minister, I think, in the Scottish Government. What was the message that you were conveying to them? Now, I should say, just by context, we're obviously looking at impacts at this stage of the inquiry, not implementation and decision making. So I'm simply interested in the message that SAB was conveying to the Scottish Government at that time about what should be done in relation to apprenticeships.
Yes, I convened the meeting in the Central Hotel in Glasgow. I knew all of the people and the stakeholders I invited because of the work I've been doing over the last few years. And I was aware of the rigidity of the system, which has taken decades to create. And it's a good system, but it's rigid. But I wanted to see if we could do all we can collectively within the law and within the framework and system that exists to do more to accelerate young people through the system. So calling it a summit would be a bit grand, but I wanted to bring people together to really ask for help and ask for a concerted focus on solving the problem. And as is the case with all human beings, people are nervous about blame or accountability, or I don't want to say anything because, you know, people might think it's my fault. I made it very clear that that group was a safe group of people, that it wasn't about apportionment of blame, it was about problem solving, it was about helping the young people. I thought about taking an apprentice with me to talk about the difficulties they were having at home from a human level. I didn't do that, having spoken to a couple of people before. I should have done, but I didn't. And I continued to work with a few of those people outside of that meeting, and other people worked together to see what could be done. The trade federation bodies were particularly active, the trade unions were particularly active, and the communication and correspondence with the minister was to keep the minister up to date, and also, you know, to make the minister aware. And we had a very good working relationship with the previous minister and the current minister, that, you know, as employers, I, as an individual, wasn't stepping on toes or looking for blame. I didn't want a post-mortem. I just wanted it fixed as properly and as fast as we could.
And what, if anything, were you suggesting in that communication to the Scottish Government could or should be done in relation to assessments of apprentices?
I think the things I outlined earlier, Chris, where I'll come on and talk about, if you can tell me if you think this is the right time, the thing which overlapped the tail end of that piece of work that we did was the triggering of the Withers Review. The Withers Review is a series of recommendations that have been put to the current minister as to how we could improve collectively the skills system, written by James Withers. The things I talked, and that review may actually resolve many of the things I described, but the things I described earlier were more agility, more flexibility, more speed, deeper employer engagement. We have good employer engagement, but it can never be close enough. So more flexibility in the skills system. The ability for apprenticeships to be made up of interchangeable modules, which we have to an extent, but we need more granular modules that can be put together to satisfy the requirements for a particular sector or industry or company. We have that to an extent, but I think we could do more. But for that to happen, the system would need to be changed. Now, it's not within SAB's gift to do that. It's the Scottish Government, the ministers, and the courts ultimately would do that. But, you know, I think and if you'd like me to expand on the Withers Review and the more up-to-date conversations I've had with the now Minister Graham Day, I'm happy to do that.
The Withers Review, yes, I'd be happy to hear about.
I think the Withers Review gives the government an opportunity to do the things I've described. To take a breath, take a step back and look at the skills system and provide a system that gives the people it's there to serve, which are employers and learners, the relevant skills and qualifications that the country needs, society needs. And that work has been underway now for about 18 months. And that, I think, is the government's opportunity, with our collective help, to get it right.
Thank you. In paragraph 14 of your statement, you say that most employers feel that the current system is outdated, bureaucratic and unnecessarily difficult. Was that a view that was held even prior to the pandemic, or
Yep.
strengthened since? Or
Yeah, it has been the view of employers that there isn't enough, that things take too long, it's too rigid, there isn't enough agility, and it's difficult to make a change. It takes a long time for change. It takes a particularly persistent sort of person to affect change in the system as it stands. Nobody's fault, but that's how the system has evolved over the last 20, 30, 40 years.
thank you. And finally then, I just wanted to ask you about things that perhaps could or should be done differently in respect of apprenticeships, given the experience of the pandemic. And I think you've touched helpfully on a number of those already. You mentioned earlier about the possibility of modularisation was one, more flexibility rather than rigidity. I think at paragraph 28 of your statement, I think you talk about more common sense being applied and how assessments are done. So are there any particular aspects that we haven't covered in your evidence today that you would like to relay or emphasise to the inquiry?
I think I'll share something that I shared and suggested to the Minister this morning. I think the Scottish Government has done a very good job in developing the skills system and continues to listen and work with industry. But I think industry, employers and the government can't be close enough. And I think that the closer we can get employers in all sectors, in all sizes, SMEs, micro businesses, PLCs, to decision makers in government, the better. There are a lot of agencies between government and employers. So the closer we can have, in some way, shape or form, employers working with government, the better.
Thank you. My Lord, I don't have any further questions to ask the witness, subject to anything that you may wish to add at this stage.
No, I don't wish to add anything. Thank you, Professor Petrie, and thank you, Mr. Stephen, as well. That concludes, I think, hearings for today, Mr. Stephen.
Yes, my Lord, it does.
Good. Very well. Until the appointed time tomorrow morning. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.